HW, welcome to the World XP podcast. How are you today?
Delighted to be with you. Just fine, thanks.
Thanks. Well, first of all, I want to appreciate your time. I'm sure you're a very busy individual, and your book was amazing. So super happy to talk to you. And we'll just jump right into it. The question from actually, let's do this first. Give the people a little bit of an elevator pitch, kind of who you are and what you do, and then we'll do the question from the last guest as always for those listening, and then we'll hop right into all things about the book.
Okay, I'm H.W. Brands. I'm a professor of history at the University of Texas at Austin. I've been writing about American history and politics for 3 decades now.
Very nice, short and sweet. The question is, what is your definition of success?
Definition of success. I think it is making a contribution to the world around you. How you define that contribution is up to you, but I think that everybody should get out of bed in the morning asking themselves, what can I do to make the world a little bit better place?
Yeah, I like that as well. I think that's a good, probably it's nice, it's simple enough to not put too much pressure on people, but at the same time lofty enough that if, like you said, if you choose to kind of define what success is for you, then you can go off and do great things.
Well,
Um,
exactly. And everybody can be a success.
exactly, 100%. So for those, I've got the book here. So for those listening, this is the book. It's called America First. Um, And the first thing that really struck me about the book, and I think you've mentioned this or maybe touched on it in some of the talks that you've given. So just a brief synopsis basically is there's a movement before World War II, kind of similar to maybe ones that we see today, about one group that doesn't want to get involved in European and foreign conflicts, and then the other one is like, no, we need to defend democracy and kind of do all these things. And the reason I kind of preface it like that is as I was reading, I was struck by the language both used by the media at that time. And in my head, I was like, I could replace Germany with Russia and Hitler with Putin, and the words apologist or sympathizer or all these things and defend democracy and all these things would be applicable to today. Like the book, like the activities of the characters, they're real people, obviously, but the activities could be translated almost to today. And that was so. Can you talk a little bit
Sure,
to
sure. Well,
that piece?
I will
Yeah.
confess that I was struck by the similarities too, and that's one of the reasons I wrote the book when I did. I've always been fascinated by this period because the United States basically turned its whole attitude about foreign affairs and about America's role in the world on its head. For 150 years nearly, the United States had taken the position that other countries' troubles were other countries' troubles and not America's troubles. George Washington, on leaving office, had said, this is the way we ought to go. Stay out of the affairs of Europe. In fact, when Washington was president, Britain and France were at war with each other. They were the chief foes in European history, and they had been for hundreds of years, and they would be for a while longer. And Washington said, it is not America's interest to get involved in those people's affairs. So stick to what's going on in the United States. He didn't use the term put America first, but if you thought of it, he would have. And so, I mean, he did acknowledge the fact that he was elected to be president of the United States, not leader of the world. And so focus on the United States. And for over a century, Americans accepted that essentially almost without challenge. They changed their minds briefly during the First World War, when Woodrow Wilson persuaded them that the world needed American help, that the United States needed to go to war to, the way, as Wilson put it, to make the world safe for democracy. And his implication was that a democracy in America would not be safe unless democracy in Europe were safe. And so Wilson sketched this ambitious policy for the United States. And Wilson actually was thinking about something broader than that. World government under the League of Nations, which was that era's version of the United Nations, but it had more teeth than the UN has. And Americans allowed themselves to be persuaded, but the American role, the American participation in the war was brief. It was less than 2 years. And at the peace conference after the war, the European allies of the United States, Britain and France primarily, imposed such harsh, such punitive terms on Germany as to almost guarantee that the Germans at first opportunity would overthrow the peace settlement and basically resume the struggle that had ended at the end of World War I. And before long at all, well, just within months, the American Senate rejected the treaty that ended the war, the Versailles Treaty, rejected American participation in the League of Nations. And it got worse from there. Americans concluded, as new evidence came out regarding who had made a lot of money during the war and all the other things that had gone, secret agreements that had made by Britain and France between them that the United States had sort of gotten on the hook for. Americans concluded that participation in the First World War had been a grave mistake. It might have even been a crime. 200,000 Americans died to no good purpose. And Americans determined in the 1920s and in the 1930s that they would never do that same thing again. They would never make that mistake again. And they codified this into law, that is, Congress did, in the mid-1930s. There were a series of laws that were called the Neutrality Acts that imposed on the president that no action, basically imposed neutrality on the president, because Americans who were alive during the First World War recognized that steps could be taken by the president that would make war increasingly likely, to the point that when Wilson finally asked for a declaration of war, Congress had no alternative but to say yes. And Americans said, we don't want that to happen again, so we're going to put handcuffs on the president to prevent him doing that. And they looked at the steps that had led to American entry into World War I. And one by one, these neutrality laws said, can't do that, can't do that, can't do that. The whole idea was keep the United States out of a war. By the late 1930s, the last of the Neutrality Acts was in 1937. By then, it looked like Europe was really bound for another war. Hitler was in power in Germany, and Hitler had been ranting and raving against the settlement out of World War I, saying it was unfair to Germany. He had already overturned some of the provisions, and he was threatening his neighbors. And it seemed really clear that another war was coming. And here's the striking thing. You pointed out the analogies between that period and recent times. And they're certainly there, but there's a very big difference. The starting point in the two places was different, because the starting point in 1939, when my story properly begins, it's about the debate primarily between Franklin Roosevelt and Charles Lindbergh and people who allied with them over whether the United States should get involved in World War II. And when my story begins, on September 1st, 1939, when the war in Europe begins, Americans are overwhelmingly opposed to the idea of getting involved in the war in Europe, but more broadly, overwhelmingly opposed to the idea that the United States ought to play this world-leading role. Now, hold that thought, because, I mean, this isn't a spoiler to say that the United States actually does get involved in World War II and does assume this world-leading role. But when we move to the present, in fact, we can sort of backdate it to when Donald Trump was elected the first time. Right. Because Donald Trump, self-consciously, although I don't really know how historically self-conscious Donald Trump himself was, but people around him were, adopted the label America First. This was the label for the most influential committee that opposed American entry into war in World War II. And I adopted it for the title of my book. I mean, partly to draw the historical connection, but also to kind of get people to pay attention to my book. You know, that's what you do when you're an author.
Yeah, it kind of worked.
yeah. So anyway, but they're operating, Trump is operating, people even today are operating from 80 years of American world leadership, where 3 generations of Americans have taken this as normal, indeed necessary. And this is why what we're seeing now, and we'll see how it turns out, Donald Trump certainly has taken steps to put this into effect, is a reversal of what happened before. So it's kind of like going back to where things were before, but it's a bigger, I don't know if it's a bigger change, but it's certainly a change in a different direction. So when the debate that I described, it starts off with the anti-war group led by Lindbergh. They're in the lead. They have the advantage. And then it's the interventionists, the pro-war side, led by Franklin Roosevelt. They're chipping away at this. Now, one of the things that comes up in my discussion here is that it's a long process at that point, because a lot of minds have to be changed, but also because the president of the United States in those days was not the dictator of American foreign policy the way the president of the United States is today. And so Donald Trump basically has it in his hands almost alone, whether the United States is going to reverse this attitude, because so much power has moved from Congress to the presidency over that time as to make this sort of change possible just by the election of one person.
Yeah, and that was that was striking it was very evident to me as well, because in the book, the amount of interactions between FDR and he's got to convince this congressperson to flip, or he's got to convince that congressperson, and there's so many scenes of Lindbergh with a senator or this person, and like the backroom dealings, I guess, for lack of a better word, is very evident in how FDR needs these people on board so he can get the declaration of war that he believes is the right answer to the situation at the time. And that was, to me, it was, I'm not uh, my political kind of paying attentions has only been where you can have a president with the stroke of a pen decide, okay, we're
Yeah.
gonna go into here and into there. But when I'm learning about history in grade school or whatever, it's like, okay, these are the three branches of government, and this is what they do. And now when I pay attention, it seems very convoluted. And so, to your point as well earlier, this era of history is very interesting to me because I think a lot of people point to like World War II as where things shifted, but after reading your book, and then I also had somebody on the podcast recently who was very heavily researching Lawrence of Arabia, and so this like end of World War I into the 20s type era of history is also very interesting to me because Herbert Hoover you mentioned a lot in the book as well, with the Des Moines speech especially was the part
Yeah.
that rang a bell to me, and he's giving Lindbergh advice on like, yeah, just because it's true doesn't mean you're supposed to say it, et cetera, et
Right.
cetera.
Right.
But like talking about after World War One, right? Immediately they were like, no, we're not doing this again, the American people. But then after World War Two, was it the same? Or like how did they I say they, how did the government or the people that wanted or had this sort of vision for globalism and that sort of thing, how was the script flipped from World War One to World War Two to where we end up to here?
Yeah, well, it flipped very dramatically. And the process was something like this, that when Franklin Roosevelt began thinking that the United States needed to get involved in the affairs of Europe, he had to do so very carefully because he understood that public opinion was strongly opposed to that. He understood that he was going to have to deal with these neutrality laws that said you're not supposed to do this. So he had to work slowly, he had to work on public opinion. And Roosevelt was a master of moving public opinion. He took care not to get ahead of public opinion. In fact, if anything, he tried to stay a little bit behind. Now, in this regard, he was helped substantially by the actions of Hitler in particular in Europe. Because in World War I, it was more of a toss-up as to which side was responsible for the war, whether it was the side of the British and the French on the one hand, or the Germans and the Austrians on the other. And because Americans, well, at the time, a third of Americans were either immigrants themselves or the children of immigrants. And overwhelmingly, they were from the countries that were at war. And so among the American people, there was a feeling that, it could be this side, it could be that side. And Americans hadn't really chosen sides. But due to the nature of the Nazi regime, due to the nature of politics in Europe in the 1930s, Americans pretty much concluded that Hitler was the bad guy. The only question was whether the United States ought to go and try to enforce good behavior on the bad guy. And as I said at the beginning, most Americans said, no, that's not what we should do. So Roosevelt didn't have to persuade Americans to pick a side sort of morally and emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
Americans were rooting for the British and the French. They were much more like America than the Germans, at least in their attitude toward politics and arrangements of party and things like that. But what he had to do is he had to change their minds over, okay, so what does that mean? And because he took a long time, over 2 years, right? So this debate goes on for over 2 years. And it's, again, as you say, because Congress has to be persuaded, American people have to be persuaded, but also Roosevelt is really changing institutional structures. So the thing that happens, this gets to this question of how do presidents gain so much power so that a president today can flip the switch in a way that Roosevelt couldn't. If Roosevelt had been able to do that, the United States would have been in World War II much sooner. But he had to move this big machinery. Well, the machinery started to change during this period because when Roosevelt asked Congress to revise the neutrality laws, for example, the first revision that he asked for was permission for American manufacturers to sell weapons to the countries at war. Now, this was the first of the neutrality laws. It said you can't sell weapons to the sides at war because there was a feeling if you start selling weapons to one side, then you develop a vested interest in that side winning. But Roosevelt made the case that due to the nature of politics in Europe during the 1930s, Germany had already rearmed. Britain and France had lagged behind. Now, some people said that was their fault, but nonetheless, Roosevelt said that if we now impose an arms embargo in the name of neutrality, it will actually have an unneutral effect because Germany already has its army ready to go, whereas the British and the French have to catch up. So he persuaded Congress to waive this requirement that you
That's a
couldn't
very
say.
that's a very clever way of putting it.
It is. And Roosevelt was exceedingly clever. I mean, there has never been a shrewder, more clever president in framing the story the way he wants it to be understood. But he also had written into this new legislation. So the legislation was revived, and it said, in the event of war, the president of the United States will determine whether it's in American interest to sell weapons to one side or the other. And so it took this out of the hands of Congress and gave it to the president. And so the critics of going to war, led by Charles Lindbergh, they pointed out that it wasn't just this question of whether the United States should go to war, but whether the president should have these new powers. And one by one, Congress handed power to the president. For example, a next step down the road is when the countries that wanted to buy American weapons, like Britain and France, ran out of money, then how are they going to pay for it? Okay, well, they could borrow money in the United States, or the United States could just give them the weapons and they could pay for them later. And that became the basis for the Lend-Lease Act of 1941, which basically said the United States will arm Britain and any other country fighting against the Axis. This is the alliance of Germany and Japan. And the president will determine which countries get it. So, for example, American policy from 1917, that's when the Russian Revolution took place, from 1917 to 1941, was opposed to communism in the Soviet Union. The communists were the bad guys in American thinking during the 1920s and 1930s. And they were only sort of supplanted by the Nazis toward the end of this. But as of 1941, there were plenty of people in America who said that the communists were just as dangerous still as the Nazis. But when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, then Roosevelt, on his own hook, without even having to consult Congress, said, okay, we're going to start sending American weapons to the communists in the Soviet Union. And the opponents of war, again, led by Charles Lindbergh, said, well, boy, this is sure a turnaround, because the president has been saying that we need to assist the British because they are the exemplars of democracy. And if Britain falls, then democracy will collapse in Europe.
We see this often, though,
yeah,
where like Britain was not, I mean, a democracy maybe a little bit in England itself, but like the colonies know, and then we see this with we see this with Ukraine currently, where like they're not really a democracy. They canceled elections and things of that nature.
Right.
And then we're gonna go help the Soviets as well, like, but also we're defending democracy. And like it's interesting to me that this line is still used when it's very evident that like they're not democracies. So you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it has something to do with the nature of democratic politics, small d democratic politics,
Right.
because most people don't pay that much attention to foreign policy. They got better things to do. They have to make a job. They got to raise their kids. They got to, all that stuff. And to get them to pay attention, you got to give them a simple message. So in the case of World War II, there got to be these good guys and these bad guys. So what is it that makes Britain better than Germany? Well, okay, so Britain, at least in Britain, is a democracy. But we have to ignore the fact that in India, it's not a democracy at all. It's an empire. And so you sort of play that down. But it became, and then if democracy doesn't fit, you just come up with something else. So for example, after the United States started sending weapons to the communists, to Stalin in the Soviet Union, well, you can't call him a Democrat. So what do? Well, you say that at least they're fighting against the evil Axis powers. And one of the big things that Roosevelt tried to emphasize was that this war in Europe is about more than Europe. And if Germany wins in Europe, then Germany is coming after the United States in North America. Now, the opponents of war said, you're crazy. You're just making this up. There's no evidence that Germany is going to come after the United States. They would be absurd to do so because they're talking, they can't even get across the English Channel. That's 30 miles. To get across 3,000 miles of the Atlantic Ocean, not a chance in the world. And it's worth noting here that the opponents of war, of World War II, were not pacifists. They weren't opposed to war in principle. They were opposed to this war
Yeah.
because they said, Europe's war is Europe's war. It's not America's war. But Charles Lindbergh and others were prepared. They said, in fact, what we ought to be doing, instead of sending weapons to Europe, we ought to be keeping those weapons at home, building up a system of naval and military bases in North America and South America. And if the Germans, try to come anywhere near, we're going to blast them out of the water. And so Lindbergh and the opponents of war were sometimes criticized for being, these soft-hearted pacifist types. But they made the point that no, we're not. It's just that we want to fight a war where it's easier for us to fight it and where the benefits to us are more direct than in the middle of Europe. Because you go to war with Stalin, on the side of Stalin, then when the war ends, then you got to deal with Stalin. And basically, you've helped Stalin. As it turned out, Stalin gained control of half of Europe, which the Soviet Union held on to for another half century.
Yeah. That's the pacifist thing as well is I feel like maybe thrown around a little bit less these days with kind of how the political parties have shifted around. But some of the other ones, so I do remember that was very clear in the book that you were like, no, these people are not pacifists. They want to blow them out of the water, but over here is like,
Right,
we just don't
right.
want to go over there,
Yeah.
which makes sense as well. And the other thing that was interesting about that, well, there's kind of two questions folded into this one, is that Lindbergh had gone to see the air forces of all the countries that would have been involved in Europe. So he kind of knew beforehand. He was like, England and France are not ready for this. Like they
Right.
can say they are, but like they're not ready for this at all. And we see this even with the development of German technology later into the war. I went to the Air and Space Museum recently with my wife, and there's like a timeline of German aviation in the museum, and and I was talking about your book to her on the way there, just
Mm-hmm.
out of relation and interest and stuff. She was like, "Wow, I didn't realize how advanced that they had actually become ahead of like the other ones, like in the late 1940s." And the other thing in the book regarding the timeline of combat is that your book makes it very clear, but also to people listening, is like the war in Western Europe was over very, very quickly, like more over than we would learn in school, where it's kind of like, oh, they're still fighting a little bit, and then the U.S. enters. Like, no, it's done. Like it's done, done. Like they have all of Western Europe, and that's why he goes to invade Russia. And that whole situation of how quick it was, and also the German, it's strange. Like Lindbergh had the right, he saw what was going to happen beforehand, but like the articulation wasn't there, and like you mentioned, FDR being very clever, and so from a technological standpoint, he comes back and he's like, okay, well, we're going to be the ones that are going to do all the fighting in Western Europe at least. But then if you look at the numbers, like the Soviet Union does a lot of the fighting as well, and we end up in this weird dichotomy sort of where it's like they're both not good, but we're going to go fight the other ones over
Yeah.
here because the ones that we say are democracies aren't even fighting at all. So like it's very
Yeah.
strange.
So when Lindbergh was making the argument that that France and Britain are not ready to fight, and that Germany will probably defeat them, he was certainly right about Germany defeating France. Britain was able to hold on
Yes.
because Germany couldn't make it across the channel. But it certainly looked like, before the United States got in, that Britain eventually was going to have to come to a negotiated settlement. And and through the 1930s, Lindbergh had been criticizing Britain especially because Britain had made all these promises that Lindbergh was pretty sure Britain couldn't keep. And he said they couldn't keep them because they weren't building the army that was necessary to enforce Britain's commitments. And Lindbergh predicted, as the other opponents of the war predicted, that what they're counting on is the United States is going to bail them out again, just like it did in the First World War. And so the British, they figure, well, we don't have to build such a big army because the Americans will come in on our side. And Lindbergh tried to tell the British that's not going to happen. And Lindbergh had a good relationship with Joseph Kennedy, who was the American ambassador to Britain and who was the father of John Kennedy, was telling them the same thing. Don't count on us. Now, those people who wanted the United States to get involved course, many people in Britain wanted the United States to get involved for very good reason. They're fighting for their lives. They portray Lindbergh and Kennedy as defeatists. Well, if you start a war that you can't win, well, yeah, it's going to end in defeat. And they pointed out something that's often forgotten, and that is that it wasn't Germany who declared war on France and Britain. It was France and Britain who declared war on Germany, albeit after Germany invaded Poland. But the British didn't have to declare a war on Germany, but they did, as unready as they were, and France as unready as it was. And so when Germany turned around and defeated them, I mean, Lindbergh could say, well, I told you that. Now, it had not occurred to Lindbergh, really, it had not occurred to just about anybody, that Germany would attack the Soviet Union, because that seemed so counterproductive, so wrong-headed. In fact, the big surprise in the weeks before the war broke out in 1939 was when Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact, so they weren't going to fight each other.
Yeah.
And as soon as that happened, then everybody said, okay, Germany's going to war, because now they've got their eastern side, they've got covered, and now they can do it. And so it really was so far beyond imagination that the United States might be fighting on the side of the Soviet Union that, I mean, Lindbergh hadn't thought of it. Franklin Roosevelt hadn't thought of it. Nobody had thought of it. But then Hitler made it possible by attacking the Soviet Union.
That's interesting that wasn't thought of maybe so much in the United States. Well, maybe let me rephrase. Having done some of the research for the T.E. Lawrence podcast, and then gone into some of the Israel-Palestine stuff, and doing some of the research into like how the Zionist migration into Israel, and you see sort of the situation of in Eastern Europe of the Jews as they go to Israel. To me, if like it makes sense that Hitler would want to do that given what he has stated his goals were as far as like the Holocaust and those and that sort of stuff, because there's a huge population, a Jewish population living in those sorts of areas. So like maybe it doesn't make sense from a strategic perspective, but like if you're nuts and you're hooked up on meth and you're going into invading countries, like that kind of makes sense. But at the same time, was the piece, so I want to keep that thought in mind, but also ask from the standpoint of, yeah, it was not even thought of that we would ally with them. Was the thought like of, okay, well, if we win or when we win, they're gonna have half of Europe as well, and then we're gonna have to deal with that? Or is that like a cross that bridge when we get there type
It was
thinking?
very much across that bridge.
Okay.
So, but Franklin Roosevelt went into the war with this plan of reviving Woodrow Wilson's idea of the League of Nations and using it to prevent a third world war. Two's bad enough, you got to prevent the third. And so he began talking up the United Nations during the war, so that even before the war was over, Americans were committed to the idea of the United Nations. And it seemed to make sense, because when you read back into the 1920s and 1930s, a lot of people concluded that if the United States had taken a leading role in world affairs, joining the League of Nations, for example, then Hitler never would have risen to power, never would have been able to accomplish what he did. And so Americans had sort of a guilty complex of, we made the wrong decision at the end of World War I by not joining the League of Nations. We're going to get it right this second time around. So we will take a lead in the United Nations. But the problem was that both the League of Nations and the United Nations, as originally conceived, they supposed that the winners at the end of the war would think along parallel lines as to how to frame the post-war world. But when the United States allied with the Soviet Union, as much as Franklin Roosevelt and his administration talked up the Soviet Union, they often spoke, instead of the Soviet Union, which is associated with communism, they talked about Mother Russia. And the evil dictator Joseph Stalin was often called Uncle Joe. And he was portrayed in the American media as this brave ally. And the soldiers of the Red Army, who were indeed brave, and they put up with a lot. And they killed a lot more Germans than Americans ever did during the war. But Americans were kind of led to believe that at the end of the war, the United States and the Soviet Union would remain allies, except that anybody who didn't arrive on the scene yesterday would realize the United States and the Soviet Union are not going to be allies. They are, as long as Hitler is alive, as long as Hitler is an enemy common to both of them. But take Hitler out of the equation, and the United States and the Soviet Union have very different ideas of how to organize the world. So to the people who have been thinking about international affairs seriously, professionally, the fact that at the end of the war, very shortly after the war, the United States had its half of Europe and the Soviet Union had its half of Europe, and things kind of stuck there for 50 years, to them that seemed the most reasonable thing in the world. But because, as I suggested earlier, Americans are not experts in foreign policy. They don't think in these terms. They think, okay, we're the good guys, and the Soviets are fighting on our side, so there must be kind of good guys too. So, at the end of the war, we can just continue to get along. Now, Roosevelt hoped maybe that would happen, but he didn't seriously think so. Stalin certainly didn't think that those capitalists of the West were going to go along with what he wanted for Eastern Europe. So I should point out here that by the time Germany was fighting the Soviet Union, when Lindbergh and other opponents of war said, we shouldn't do this, what they said was, if we do this, we're going to be making the world safe for Soviet communism. And they're going to be in control of half of Europe, before this war is over. And they pointed out, Lindbergh pointed out explicitly, he said, if the United States goes into Europe again, it will never get out of Europe. And here we are, 85 years after the fact, and there's still tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of American troops in Europe.
Yeah. When I read that, I was like, oh, the foresight on that is a little bit nuts. I want to ask this question before I forget. It's not really chronologically with what we're going, but the comparison of every new I'll say bad leader somewhere to Hitler seem I what are your thoughts on that? And it's not just Putin. It was Saddam Hussein. I think Assad was in Syria was probably compared to Hitler, and there's been others who don't control nearly the technological or the military might that Hitler did. Like, what are your thoughts on? I mean, aside from the fact that that evokes some sort of emotion out of most people, like
Yeah.
that guy's bad, but like I don't know from the standpoint, is it really that simple? Is it just that guy's bad, or is there more to it
So
than that?
you've raised a central question of American foreign policy in the decades after World War II, and you've said it in an appropriate context. So yeah, there's this temptation to look upon every bad guy, every autocrat after World War II as another Hitler. That is, you look upon them that way if you have a mind to engage in military action against them. If you don't, then you don't cast them in those terms. Then so the United States has tolerated bad guys in Latin America, tolerated bad guys in various other countries around the world. The regime in South Vietnam, the United States was defending, was by no means democratic. So you don't use the analogy there, but when you're thinking of intervening against those people, you say, well, this is another Hitler. And the thinking there was, in fact, there was a term for it. It was sort of the Munich syndrome. Munich, named for the city in southern Germany, where there was an agreement before World War II to let Hitler have part of Czechoslovakia, in the idea that that would appease his demands for more. But he turned out he was lying, and he wanted more after that. So the thinking was, if the United States had stood up to Hitler at Munich in 1938, then there wouldn't have been a 1939, that there wouldn't have been a World War II. Probably the Germans would have overthrown Hitler. But anyway, so the question is, well, after World War II, when the United States decided that Stalin was a bad guy and he needed to be contained, so there was talk that Stalin is the new Hitler, or that Ho Chi Minh was the new Hitler, or that leaders of North Korea were the new Hitler, or Saddam Hussein was the new Hitler. Now, there are two questions that get kind of confused here. One is, what's the psychology of the dictator? I mean, we could even talk about whether these people are actually dictators, but what's the psychology of the autocrat? And did Stalin hope to accomplish what Hitler was trying to accomplish? That's one question. The other question is the Soviet Union in 1950 like the Germany in 1938? So there's the leader, and then there's the country the leader leads. Now, Stalin did have, in the case of the Soviet Union was a powerful country in the 1950s. But given the way Stalin gained power, given the way Stalin fought World War II, it was really a bad analogy to think that Stalin was going to engage in the expansive aggression that Hitler did, because his ideology was not that way at all. But this connection of somebody like Saddam Hussein to Hitler, that is really tenuous, because even if Saddam Hussein as a person had been like Hitler as a person, Iraq in 2003 was not the same as Germany in 1939. So you have to sort of evaluate the leader, but then you also have to ask about the country that this person's leading. Germany in 1939 was a powerful war machine, and it had the capacity to inflict great pain on its neighbors. Iraq in 2003 didn't have capacity to do anything like that.
Yeah. And I guess it gets to the question of the differences between, right? We talked a lot about the similarities of that time to now, but the difference is in terms of like, one, I would argue that that sort of figure doesn't really exist now. People might point to Putin, and then I would say, well, Hitler rolled over half of Europe in 6 months, and Putin spent 3 years in Ukraine. So I would maybe not quite the same. But then the other side of it is like a lot of these comparisons now with the way that there's a different media landscape and also a different political landscape that don't allow for the same. I guess what I was getting at with my last question of more is it seems like if there was a vested interest in keeping kind of the global or the UN sort of worldview, that an evolution of the messaging for public opinion would have taken place. And that, I think, is the thing for me that I am trying to wrap my head around why that has not quite taken place, because the calling somebody a sympathizer or an apologist, that still happens, and the comparisons that are used often kind of like the Saddam Hussein one, even this 20 years ago now, fall apart at the like a rudimentary examination of like, okay, well that's not really the same situation. And that's the thing that to me I was like, okay, I understand how this is taking place in 1939. But now for for like me to be able to just like do a find and replace on the different countries
Yeah.
or leaders or whatever, but it's like now we've got a podcast and the internet and all these things that people are like, that doesn't make any sense, and we see that a lot more openly now rather than maybe Lindbergh in like Madison Square Garden or something like that.
Right.
It's more
Yeah.
widespread.
So the best answer I have to your question is that the advocates of American intervention, whether it's in Europe in World War II or in Korea in the 1950s or in Southeast Asia in the 1960s, the Persian Gulf, whatever it is, the advocates of intervention, these are people who believe in this world-leading role for the United States. I think they got lazy. They got lazy in the sense that by the end of World War II, especially, I mean, starting with the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor, which basically cut the legs out from under the anti-war argument.
Yeah.
So they got used to the idea that the people who had been opposed to war, whom they then called the isolationists, which they weren't, but they called them that, and it was always a demeaning term. And the editorial cartoon about them was an ostrich with its head in the sand, where they're just not paying attention to the world around. But they were able to cast the isolationists, as they called them, as short-sighted, as foolish, and maybe just bad people. Because if you had opposed entry into World War II, then you could be cast as a Nazi sympathizer. So you liked Hitler. And then, especially after the depths of the Holocaust were discovered, well, you probably liked the Holocaust too. So you're an anti-Semite by side. You're just a bad person. And so for 40 years after World War II, to call somebody, especially in the corridors of power or on the streets of Washington, D.C., if you call them an isolationist, that was a career-ending thing, if you could make that stick on them. And so when people were saying we ought to escalate the American role in Vietnam, and other people said, wait a minute, Vietnam's not a good place to fight. Then the ones who wanted to intervene, they said, to escalate, they said, you're an isolationist. And the others, oh boy, you can't call me an isolationist. So I had to back off. And the same thing was true with Saddam Hussein in the 1990s and early 2000s. And it even got to be true when the United States started sending aid to Ukraine, that if you
Yeah.
opposed aid to Ukraine, you were an isolationist. So, and And the interventionists, to talk about the opposite number to the isolationists, they were just so used to winning the argument just by saying you're an isolationist. But generations passed. And if you had lived through the run-up to World War II and World War II, then isolationism, that had an emotional effect on you. But those people didn't live forever. They died. Their children came along. Their grandchildren came along. They didn't remember that stuff. And so by the year 2010, 2016, 2020, to call somebody in isolation in the United States, it meant something to people who were 75 years old and had been in the foreign policy center. It didn't mean anything to somebody who was 25. And so the advocates of American continued leadership, and there's certainly an argument for this, they just didn't keep up with the evidence. They could have made the argument, but they needed fresh evidence. They couldn't say, well, he's like Hitler. And you're talking to a generation, well, who's Hitler? I mean, I exaggerate a little bit, but not that much. I mean, there certainly wasn't that emotional response to Hitler that there had been before. And I think one of the reasons that Donald Trump, well, the reason he won in 2016 was he sort of took the political system by surprise. And he won in 2024 when everybody knew if you elect Donald Trump, you're going to get a policy that looks very different than the policy of Joe Biden, the policy has gone before. Now, it is true that American presidential elections are never decided primarily or even exclusively by positions on foreign policy. There's a lot of other things going on. But nonetheless, people could see there was a difference between what you get for foreign policy if you elect Donald Trump, what you get if you elect Kamala Harris. And Americans chose Donald Trump. So the advocates of a continued leadership role for the United States, they just hadn't made that case strongly enough with fresh evidence. You could make the case, I mean, you could have made the case against Saddam Hussein as Saddam Hussein if you wanted to. You could make it against Vladimir Putin. You could make it against Xi Jinping. But you got to make it. You can't just call him Hitler. But they'd so gotten used to doing that that's what they often fell back on, and it didn't work for them. And so we're now apparently in this new age.
Yeah, that's interesting. I completely agree. I was in a conversation. I was like, it feels like the foreign policy kind of advocates for American global influence, let's say, have gotten, I think the word I used was sloppy. It's like it feels like they got sloppy.
Yeah.
Okay, so I know we got a little bit of time left, but I want to sort of maybe wrap up on the right before Pearl Harbor. Well, I guess let me do this instead. Do you have other things that maybe fit within the conversation, right? There's so much that we could talk about, of course, about the time period, but other things that maybe fit within the conversation that I haven't asked that you think would be good context for the things that we've discussed?
Well, I would want to elaborate a little bit more on something we did talk about, and that is the shift in power from Congress to the president in all areas of politics and public life, but especially in foreign policy. And so the last time Congress declared a war was in December 1941. And the United States has fought 5 full-scale wars since then and a bunch of military interventions. And Americans are simply used to the idea that Congress just goes along with whatever a president says. And so we have handed control of this crucial aspect of American policy, the cutting edge of American policy toward the world. We've handed it over to the president. And the president makes this decision. Okay, I guess we got to do that. And the president's commander in chief, and it's as though we're on a permanent wartime footing. So the president says the troops are going to go in there. And once the troops go in and Americans start getting killed, then Congress and the public, they have to go along. You can't pull the plug on a war that's already underway. But it's sharp in foreign policy, but it's sort of everywhere else. So the president decides himself. Will there be tariffs against Canada, against Mexico, against China? That's supposed to be in Congress. The Constitution says that Congress has a control over trade policy. Immigration, the president decides, well, we're going to deport 10 million people or not. Well, immigration policy is supposed to be with Congress. And so Americans have just gotten used to this idea that the president is the center of politics, is the center of everything. And what this does is it makes American policy really unpredictable and unreliable. And this last part, the unreliable, is crucial because
completely agree.
To an extent that Donald Trump and the modern American firsters don't acknowledge, American power during the period from World War II to the present has rested a great deal on the cooperation of other countries. It's not that the United States has compelled Britain to join the United States in various things, has forced France. The United States, during World War II and afterwards, generated a lot of goodwill for the United States. And these were decisions that were really important to those countries. So helping out Britain and France during World War II, the Marshall Plan afterwards, all this other stuff. But you can squander it very quickly.
Yeah.
And so we elect a president, and the current president we have has got elected by 1.5 percentage points in the popular vote. It's not a landslide. So Americans, it's unclear what Americans think about foreign policy, but it's also kind of immaterial what Americans think about foreign policy because of the fact that we've given so much control to the president. So I'm not sure if you can wind the clock back on that. I mean, Congress actually could. Congress tomorrow could say that we are going to rescind the authority we've given the president to set tariffs because these are all given on emergency and the president's judgment. They could rewrite that law. It's a tough one to do, especially under the current president with the current Republican Party, but it may be that Americans will decide, we were better off when we made these decisions by committee than when we just gave them over to one person.
Mm. That reminded me of something I wanted to ask earlier. Do you have time for one more?
Yeah, one more, sure.
So when FDR is he's got this vision of reviving Wilson's global kind of vision of the world with League of Nations and such. And today we look at oftentimes the first question that somebody asks if a politician is like, oh, I think we should do this. The first question that somebody asks is like, okay, well, who's paying them? Was that the case necessarily then? Like what I guess what I'm getting at is how much more it seemed like based on your book that the public was a bit more educated or informed and there was more of a policy debate rather than a maybe monetary situation currently to maybe beat around the bush. But you understand what I mean? Like,
Yeah. I'll expand the question a little bit.
sure.
So, I mean, a lot of this is mediated through the fact that with social media, everybody has a megaphone.
Yeah.
And so this wasn't the case back then. Making government policy was confined to a small group, the hundreds of members of Congress, the president, the media in Washington. It was a relatively small town. And outsiders, they just had to go with what they read. There wasn't even television in those days. Nowadays, you can be, up to speed immediately. And with social media, the public can yell back. And there are people who just make this their mission. They make this their living. The more views you get on YouTube, the more followers you get on your podcast. So there is an incentive these days to go extreme. And I'll just add one other thing. The two political parties have conspired to give more control through political primaries to the zealots in their parties. So it's the right wing of the Republican Party that determines who the nominees are going to be. It's the left wing of the Democratic Party that does that. And so politics has been pulled to the margins. There was much more overlap between the parties and among this group that considered themselves sort of the permanent government, not in the sense of a deep state or anything like that, but people who'd been members of Congress for a long time. And they knew members of the opposite party, and they would go out for a drink with members of the opposite party. And they had this sense that they were engaged in this noble enterprise. Yeah, there were kind of rough edges around it, but they all thought they were doing something good. Whereas we live in a time when probably a majority of Americans think of the government as this evil thing, and that when Donald Trump and his new administration basically declares war on the government, he gets cheered on certainly by his supporters, and a lot of people are willing to go, well, let's see how this works out. So the temperament of the American political system is very different than it was then. And it leans more toward the extremes than toward the middle as it used to.
Makes sense. Well, I thank you for your time. The book, again, well, I think it's backwards in the thing, but you people get the idea. You can get it where Amazon, everywhere people can get books.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Anything else that you want to plug or talk about before we get out of here?
That's very good. They can follow me on Substack. I'm at hwbrands.substack.com.
Awesome. Well, for those listening, I'll put that link in the description below as always. And thank you guys for listening, and we will see you guys next time. Peace. Thanks for tuning in to the World XP podcast. If you want to watch another episode like this one, click there. If you want to subscribe, click there.